So welcome to day 3 of AFOSR Spring Review. You're going to hear from the rest of the Information Decision and Complex Networks Department of AFOSR today. And we've had a lot of interesting interaction with folks based on the talks so far, so I encourage you today to don't be shy, interact with our POs here because it's good for them and it's hopefully useful for you as well. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Ben Knott, who runs our Trust and Influence program, and he's going to take it from here.
Thank you, Bob. Good morning. So, as Bob said, I'm Ben Knott. I'll give you a little background on myself because I know I haven't met some of you. I'm currently with the 711th Human Performance Wing at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. I'm within the Human Effectiveness Directorate and the Applied Neuroscience branch within that wing. I have not yet transitioned to Virginia, but I'm hoping to do that, of course, very soon. So this is the Trust and Influence portfolio. In general, the work done of this portfolio is motivated by some of the recent technological advances, in particular in the area of automation and autonomous systems, and also the unique strategic environment that the Air Force is operating in today and expected to be in the future. We're looking at a broader range of more unpredictable threats. We're operating in areas where we're dealing with failed and failing states, which means we're dealing with a combination of state and non-state actors that include extremist groups. And this is very different than in decades past, but we expect to be operating in that environment. That will continue. On the technological side, we're seeing the rapid proliferation of the use of automation and more autonomous systems in a way, and unmanned systems, and that's fundamentally changing thrusts of reliance, and this is trying to understand how we establish, maintain, and repair trust with other agents. That's both human and machine. And the science of influence is how do we shape the behavior, attitudes, and beliefs of others. You can further break that down into 4 sub-areas: trust and autonomous systems, cross-cultural trust, behavioral effects of influence, tactics, and the cognitive mechanisms of those of influence. Within the context of this portfolio, when I talk about autonomous systems, I'm talking about systems that are capable of acting autonomously, but they're also designed to interact cooperatively with people. And we're interested in the interface, the interaction between those systems and people. And the assumption is that trust is a fundamental mechanism. It's a fundamental driver of that interaction. In cross-cultural trust, we're interested in the differences in how you build, maintain, and repair trust over time across cultures. Across cultures. So what generalizes to different communities, different cultures, and what does not, what changes. We're primarily interested in interpersonal and organizational trust in that area, but that could also apply to autonomous systems. We think there's probably differences in how people interact and trust autonomous systems. Behavioral effects of influence tactics. This could be policy, developmental activities, could be the way that we communicate with our partners, but we're also interested in some of the behavioral and psychological effects of new advanced weapon systems, and that would include unmanned platforms, some of the new directed energy platforms. It also would include social media. How does social media motivate people and influence people in cyberspace? We're interested in those behavioral effects, but we're also interested in the cognitive mechanisms that drive those behavioral effects, and in some cases, the neural underpinnings of those cognitive mechanisms. So the motivation for the trust part of the portfolio, in particular automation, is coming from two major studies, Global Horizons and Tech Horizons, and I have a quote up here. In the near to midterm, developing methods for establishing certifiable trust and autonomous systems is one of the greatest challenges that we have. Tech Horizons in particular identifies trusted, adaptive, and flexibly autonomous systems as major capability need. It sees those autonomous systems as they must be able to operate in human-machine teams in adversarial environments. It also calls for a closer coupling between again, driver here. For CrossCultural Trust, the motivation there is coming from understanding the behavioral, social, and cultural forces that shape areas of the world of strategic interest to us. We also know that an understanding of different cultures in counterinsurgency operations has increasing importance, as does human intelligence in those areas. And it's important to be able to engage populations in the area that we're operating in, and CrossCultural Trust addresses that. Some of the scientific challenges people study autonomy know that when you introduce automated systems and autonomy, you often have unintended consequences on operations overall. An example of that is when autonomous systems are highly trusted, they often lead to over-reliance and what we call automation-induced complacency, where people, they become highly reliant, they lose situational awareness, they're actually slow to react and respond to problems and challenges when they do come up. On the other hand, if we observe faults or errors in automation, we often become under-reliant. We try to work around automation. We're not realizing the advantages that automation offers us. So we have over-reliance, we lose situational awareness, we lose some of our effectiveness, under-reliance, we're not realizing the potential of what automation has to offer. We're looking for properly calibrated trust, and that is trust calibrated to the capabilities of the autonomous system. To complicate matters, there are significant individual differences in our propensity to trust, to over-rely or under-rely on automation. And we call this trust bias. But that complicates the space, and it suggests there's no kind of one-size-fits-all for automated systems. Underscores possibly the need for automated systems that actually adapt to the differences between operators. Most of what we know about trust comes from studies, psychological studies with people. It's a human phenomenon, but we're interested to know to what extent our models and understanding of trust generalize to automated systems and robotic systems. So what do we understand about how people develop and maintain trust will apply to non-human systems? And we don't know. Also, most of the research in trust is based on research done in the West. In fact, almost all of it. There's some cross-cultural trust studies, but it's very recent. There's been no systematic kind of exploration of that. And so there's a need to understand trust in a more global context because we are dealing with international partnerships and adversaries, and this portfolio is very well positioned to do that. Opportunities. One of the big opportunities here is to identify the basic fundamental principles of trusted human-machine teaming. We're particularly interested in interactions with human-like automation. There's been a lot of advances driven by DARPA, for example, with the robotics challenge in developing robotic systems that behave like people. They're they're capable of operating environments where people do and doing some of the same things, having the same mobility, for example. But our niche here can be in understanding the principles of developing trust between those systems and people. And that's a unique area, and not a lot of work has been done in that area. And of course, the cross-cultural work will help drive policy, operational planning, and general education for our airmen. We all have kind of an intuitive idea for what trust is. Everybody has experienced trust. It's a very human thing, but I wanted to put some definition around it. So this is a definition provided by Roger Mayer. He's one of the kind of leaders in this area, and this is, there's different views, but this is a very well accepted definition of trust. So the willingness of individuals to accept vulnerabilities from the actions of others with little ability to monitor their actions. He also identifies 3 factors that are fundamental in building or in trustworthiness, and so the building of trust, and those are ability, benevolence, and integrity. So that definition and those factors together can form a sort of framework for the rest of the work in this portfolio, and you'll see that in the examples that I give. It's also important to keep in mind that trust is dynamic. It changes over time. What's important in the beginning in building trusted relationships is not necessarily what's important later on in maintaining and repairing trust. And this calls for unique methods of measuring trust over time. We don't have very good methods of measuring the modulation and the dynamics of trust over time. And that will be part of this portfolio. And most importantly, trust leads to reliance behavior. It leads to very specific behaviors that will affect performance in human performance systems. And so that's why we're studying it. I'm now going to give a few examples of grants from the portfolio that kind of show where the portfolio is headed and what the priorities are. The first one is a grant to Dr. David Atkinson at the Institute for Human and Machine Cognition. This is the role of benevolence and trust in autonomous systems. Dr. Atkinson is trying to define, he's interested in robotic systems. He's trying to define those basic characteristics, attributes, and behaviors in a robotic system that will facilitate the development of trust. He's particularly interested in benevolence as one of those 3 factors, ability, integrity, and benevolence. It's not obvious that this would be important in a machine, the idea of benevolence, but this is one of those tests of whether human models of trust translates into human-machine trust. So he has a 3-phased approach for this. The first is an exploratory survey research, followed by an empirical experimental phase, followed by formalizing what's learned from phases 1 and 2 into kind of requirements for design. So in the survey research, it takes the form of what he calls a set of challenge scenarios, where he's giving people, it's basically a thought experiment. They're putting themselves into a certain situation, and they're being asked, in a situation, would you choose to work with an automated system or a human? And I have examples over here on the right. So he looked at automated transportation, automated financial management, medical care, disaster management, and emergency rescue as examples. And so he put people into these scenarios, asked them questions about their preferences for how they would act and rely on either human or machine, and then gave them a questionnaire of 28 different attributes related to trust to see what attributes people thought were important in those contexts. And he collected a lot of individual data about people as well, so personality type measurements and demographics. And the important finding from this is that there are very striking differences between the different applications, which might not be too surprising, but it's important because it means that what drives and facilitates trust in these relationships is very context dependent. It's dependent on a very specific application. And moreover, there are huge individual differences. They're based on personality. So For instance, for some reason, people who are extroverted are much more willing to work with automated systems. People who are more open to social risk are much more likely to want to deal with automated systems. This paints kind of a complex scenario where you can't come up with a set of requirements that would fit across all contexts, but rather you have to design those requirements within that context and taking into account the individual differences. So the idea here is you can start to map out that space, all the different attributes, behaviors, and characteristics that are important within the context of those things. And so an example of that is for financial management, people think that accuracy of the data perhaps is one of the more important things. That's not surprising. But for medical care, showing goodwill towards patient is actually more important. And so that's related to, in terms of those three drivers, ability and benevolence. And so you're seeing an emphasis on different factors based on the context. Of course, what people say and what people do are often very different, and so you have to you have to test this in an experimental environment. And the one that they developed here is an immersive synthetic environment where they put people into a specific scenario. What they're working with right now is a scenario in which people have to enter a warehouse. They encounter a fire, so there's an emergency. They have to egress, and they encounter a robotic system that offers assistance in egress. And what they're looking for is reliance behavior. How do people respond to the robotic systems? Do they accept help? Do they not? Are they hesitant? They'll measure a wide range of behaviors, and then again, they'll follow up with some subjective assessment. But different populations of people will encounter different robots with different characteristics programmed in. Now, this is driven by real AI. There's real kind of robotic AI driving this, but since they're doing it in a virtual environment, this allows them to quickly iterate through different configurations, different vectors of attributes, and then measure the behavioral effects. So I like this approach for that reason. It helps search through that space and narrow in on what is very important, and you can change the context very easily because it's in a virtual environment. So one example of a manipulation is during a fire, some people will encounter a fire bot, and some people will encounter a janitor bot. And what they're starting to see, they're just starting to do experimentation, but what they're starting to see is people, of course, think the fire bot's very well equipped to help them out, but they see janitor bot as being more benevolent because it doesn't have to help you out. It's not its job. So she gets very interested, and that actually affects behavior. And so
you would value benevolence over competency?
In some contexts, but really the question is, do those human models translate to, and how does that affect behavior? The last phase of that is they will take whatever they learned from the first two phases, formalize that into a set of requirements, and that will be one of the deliverables. I like that because there's a discovery phase, but then they're working towards a transitionable product. The next example is neural signatures of trust during human automation interactions. This is work done by Frank Kruger at George Mason University. The idea here is to look for basic neural correlates of trust in human-human and human-machine interactions. The experimental task in this case is a security screening task. Subjects have to look at x-rays. They're looking for weapons in those x-rays, and they are advised by either a human or an automated advisor. Trust behavior is operationalized here as taking that advice or not. They are then given feedback on whether the advisor was correct, and they move on to the next trial. The researchers are using fMRIs to do brain scans during the decision phase and during the feedback phase to see what neural mechanisms mediate those processes. They're also interested in individual differences in learning over time. So the experimental design is here, where you have human versus machine advisor. You have people with high automation bias and low automation bias as propensity to rely or not rely on automation, and then learning over time. Here are some of the initial results. As you would expect, there's interaction between automation bias and the advisors. So high automation bias subjects tend to take the advice of the automated system, and vice versa for low automation bias. For the fMRI results, we see that the critical brain area is the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and you see activation levels that are higher for the non-preferred advisor. So high automation bias, you get higher levels of activation in that area when you're considering the advice of the human advisor, and then again, vice versa. This is a brain area that's sometimes associated with appraisal of risk. And so one possible interpretation is that people are seeing the advice of the non-preferred advisor as being more risky to accept that advice, and therefore you see higher activation in those areas. But in some way, automation bias is being coded and mediated by that area of the brain. We see that as far as the trust behavior goes, the bias goes away over time. It turns out that the human and the automation are equally reliable in this particular experiment, and people do learn that over time, so they rely on both equally. However, during the feedback phase, you get the key functional brain areas, the nucleus accumbens, and you see greater activation in the area of the preferred advisor this time. So when you're being advised by the human and you have low automation bias, you see higher activation and vice versa. This is an area of the brain that's often associated with reinforcement learning and reward. So even though your behavior changes over time and you show that you're developing trust for your advisor, you're seeing greater activation in the reward areas when you're receiving advice from the advisor that you prefer, you're biased towards. So this is the first study I'm aware of that looks at the neural correlates of trust in comparison to human and machine advisors. This kind of work eventually can be used to develop real-time metrics. If you know what's happening in the brain, you know where it is, you can start to look for ways to measure trust dynamically, or functions related to trust dynamically over time. For CrossCultural Trust, this is a grant to Roger Mayer. This is one of our larger grants. When I said earlier our models of trust are based largely on Western models, this is one of our answers to that problem. Roger Mayer has an experimental paradigm that is very well validated and accepted here in the US and other places as well. It's designed to evaluate those three factors of trustworthiness, but also evaluate properties of the truster and the trustee. You can look at different power relationships, different organizational structures. Again, widely published, widely accepted. The goal behind this grant is to take that experimental method and replicate that globally. So he plans to take that to 20 different countries, Eastern, Western Europe, Asia, and Africa, and replicate those studies and see what generalizes and what does not. This is fantastic project. I'm excited about it. It will create a very unique data set that will allow us to understand the dynamics of trust worldwide. Nobody's done anything like this. There is some evidence that we should expect to see differences. We know that in individual cultures, we rely more on ability in our initial development of trusting relationships. In more collectivist cultures, they tend to rely more on benevolence and integrity as the main drivers. So that's one example, but this will give us a very systematic, large-scale view. The work hasn't started, or at least the data collection hasn't started. We're currently working on all the logistical difficulties of doing data collection in 20 different countries, but this will be very high-impact work.
How long does that time you plan for that to run in the first phase?
The first phase, which is setting up all those partnerships and getting the mechanisms in place, is underway right now, and then it will take there's 2 years left on the grant to do the data collection and then publishing the results.
And I assume you're going to look at that, a certain area, Asia, Africa, Middle East looks particularly interesting, then there might be the possibility of a follow-on grant focused more on that area.
Yeah, that's certainly possible. I think there's a partial list of countries of interest there. It's a developing list, but yes, that's exactly right. This is going to be an initial cut at something very ambitious, and then you could go in and further elaborate. And yes?
In a lot of these countries, we teach to fly. And I'm just curious if you went back when you started this and looked at sort of the risk calculus of the the educated aviators that are coming over that we're teaching to fly, and then where is risk and trust?
That's exactly the kind of thing we're trying to get at, right?
And I can see where you get it for the educated class, and I know what it looks like, say, for the Russians.
Oh, I
see. A lot of time looking at Russian risk calculus versus U.S. risk calculus individually and then as a group. And I just kind of curious, Mayor is pretty famous, but are you looking then at this body of knowledge that we already have, within the Air Force? And I would say that pilot training would be a really interesting body of knowledge
That's actually an interesting point, and that's something I could help facilitate. I could bring in Roger Mayer to talk to some of our warfighters. Right, yep. And that's actually a great point. And we contact with the actual warfighters who are out there doing the work, no doubt can inform the research.
It's a narrow segment of population in those countries, but it's one that you probably got a uniform.
We have experience, yeah, right.
We also have decades of work with coalition partners and
yeah, those kinds of interactions can help kind of form and sharpen your hypotheses for what you're looking at. And so it is actually invaluable. And in general, as part of my research philosophy, is you got to have contact with people out in the field doing the work. Yeah.
Very well, certainly use the air attaches, because in their context, they have to make, perceptions of the information they're gathering and the validity, and that's based upon what are the motivations of the person I'm talking to, et cetera. So that's another group where you probably could get some insight.
Thank you. So I just realized I only have about 7 minutes, so I'm going to try to motor through the rest of this pretty quickly. So the motivation for the influence side is coming from various leaders across the DoD. The one shown here is by the Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, General Flynn, and he's calling for a need to look outside of our traditional considerations of warfare and look at the precursors of warfare. So what are those things that motivate and influence people towards armed conflict? And that will allow us to get involved in phase 0 operations where we can look at deterrence strategies or shape the environment in which we're working in. Also, ACC has requested to AFRL to help provide research that will allow us to understand the full scope of implications of the use of different types of emerging weapons platforms. And so that includes taking into account the kinetic effects of weapons, but also the behavioral and psychological effects. And that's, we know a little bit about that, but there's a lot of good work to be done in this area. Let's see, I think I'm going to skip through the rest of this chart to move on to the examples. But there are a lot of challenges here, and I'll point out that one of the biggest challenges is, let's say you want to understand the behavioral effects of a particular weapon system. Very hard to do that in a lab. You can't study that in a lab. You have to get out in the field. So you have access problems. You have to get your researchers where in places of the world where this matters and where they can talk to the people who are affected by these things. It also calls for some novel kind of experimental techniques so you can get good, robust and reliable results, which is a real challenge. As far as the scope of influence goes, we're looking at basically three main areas: psychological and behavioral effects of advanced weapon systems, which I've mentioned. We have a BRI structured around that question. The effects of social media in motivating, influencing, and mobilizing people. That's I'm starting to see a lot of growth in that area. And then those precursors of conflict, what motivates people towards radical groups, conflict, and militarization. So the first example is in the